Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're going to be talking about something that just went down just a couple hours ago, to be honest. Antonio Brown has been traded to the Oakland Raiders. My goodness, wow, this comes pretty abruptly. I know there were a couple rumblings going around the National Football League about him perhaps being traded sooner rather than later because the Steelers had a deadline. But they've made a deal. They've struck a deal with the Oakland Raiders. Exactly what is the deal? Antonio Brown will be going to the Oakland Raiders in exchange for a 3rd and 5th round pick. Obviously, the Raiders, they're restructuring his contract in order to make him the highest paid wide receiver in the National Football League, giving him about $50 million for 3 years and $30 million guaranteed, which is ridiculous in itself. So congratulations to Antonio Brown. And at least he's out of the hair of the Steelers, which is unfortunate for them, but ain't no big deal. They get compensation. They get to take him off the cap space and get a couple picks. So anyway, as I usually like to do, we like to talk about the fantasy implications of all of the specific free agent pickups, the trades, and big information like this. So that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to talk about the fantasy implications of Antonio Brown being on the Raiders as we approach the 2019 fantasy football season. So let's get right into that. So obviously, it's pretty big news. It affects both parties, right? Ben Roethlisberger not having Antonio Brown. I mean, he's been a Steeler his entire career. And, not looking and seeing Antonio Brown number 84 out on your right or left, it's going to be a pretty big deal. But we'll talk about Juju Smith-Schuster and how it affects him in a little bit. But I just want to specifically talk about Antonio Brown. Now, we know he's an extremely talented wide receiver. That is a given, and no one is going to argue that. It's an argument you're never going to win. He's been a top 3 receiver for, quite frankly, the last 6 seasons. Since the 2013 season, Antonio Brown has averaged 114 receptions, 1,524 receiving yards, and 11 receiving touchdowns each season on average. I mean, there's been seasons where he's had 1,800 receiving yards or 130 receptions, or just this last season, 15 receiving touchdowns. But on average, again, I'll repeat this, 114 receptions, 1,524 receiving yards, and 11 touchdowns. I mean, he is just as productive as it gets. Fantasy-wise, he's just been a top 3, and we've known, for the last couple seasons, I would say probably the last 4-5 seasons, he's been a first-round pick in regular standard 1 QB leagues. Even in 2 QB leagues, he goes in the first round because of his consistency, his reliability, and honestly, his fantasy production is it's incredible. It's something that we don't usually see, especially coming out of the wide receiver position. I know there's other receivers like DeAndre Hopkins that's stepping up as recently, and Julio Jones, who's been consistent. But I mean, when we're talking about consistency, it's Antonio Brown without a doubt in my mind. So for sure, he himself, we can praise him as much as we possibly want, but I want to talk about the implications of how the Raiders can potentially improve on this, right? Now, we're assuming that Derek Carr is going to be the quarterback. I'm not sure what they're doing in the Raiders, front office, what new hired GM Mike Mayock wants to kind of scheme. I know they have a lot of first-round picks because of trading away Khalil Mack and trading away Amari Cooper, both for first-round picks. They've accumulated, 3 first-round picks for this season, both from the Bears, the Cowboys, and from themselves. So they're pretty set this year to go out and make a draft, be pretty successful. 3 first-round picks, that's nothing to mess around with, especially with all the talent that's available this season. Now, whether they go and draft a quarterback, that remains to be seen. But as of right now, I'm going to assume that Derek Carr is going to be the starting quarterback for the future of this team. Now, if anything changes, then so be it. But let's talk about Derek Carr a little bit. Statistically, just this past season, 2018, I've mentioned it in my prior videos, especially during the regular season and in the fantasy season. Derek Carr isn't a good fantasy quarterback. He may be a decent quarterback in the National Football League, but fantasy-wise, he is not consistent enough, right? He only threw 19 touchdowns this past season, which, it just doesn't cut it in fantasy. You're basically averaging 1 touchdown per game. It's just It's not going to cut it. So as we, look at his statistics, what can we take away from the 2018 season that shows some promise, right? The things that kind of popped out to me, he had his highest completion percentage of his entire career. He threw and had 68.9% completion percentage, which was, the highest of his career. That's pretty good, right? It only took him this many years, but looking at his other completion percentages, it was in the low 60s, 61, 63, 62. So this is kind of a little bit of an uptick, 69% passing completion, pretty good. Other than that, he also was able to throw for 4,000 yards this season, which was the first time he had done that in his entire career. Imagine that. He's had some pretty good seasons, Derek Carr, in which he threw for 32 touchdowns, 28 touchdowns, especially that one year where the Raiders won the AFC West. So, he's had good years, but he was never able to eclipse that 4,000 passing mark. Perhaps he'll be able to do that with Antonio Brown. There's always a possibility. But what makes Derek Carr either a high-end quarterback, which we've seen him be, or a low-end quarterback? I think it's really determined on his surroundings. What weapons and what kind of protection does Derek Carr have? Now, to talk about his protection, let's talk about the offensive line of the Raiders and what Antonio Brown is potentially going into. Not even 2 years ago, in 2017, the Raiders, they had a fantastic offensive line. They honestly did. They had a top 5 offensive line for sure with Hudson, Osimile, Jackson, and then I think they just drafted a left tackle rookie who's been playing well, and then they had Donald Penn. They had a fantastic offensive line. In fact, they were the highest paid offensive line, if I'm not mistaken, a couple years back. As of right now, currently, they're the 5th highest paid offensive line. So they know they have talent there. They've invested in this offensive line, but just this past season, according to I messed that one up. Pro Football Focus's 2018 top offensive line rankings, they ranked 28th amongst all offensive lines. They were a top 5. I'm telling you, these guys were amazing. This team was, Latavius Murray was statistically a pretty good running back behind this offensive line for many seasons because of how good this offensive line was, just strictly off running up people down the, running it up teams' throats and just dominating up front. Right? There's a reason why Derek Carr wasn't throwing for 4,000 plus yards a season, because the run game consistently worked for this team. This last season really it didn't. The offensive line was awful. They did not look good. Both of the tackles gave up a combined 26 sacks. Stuff that you can't, consistently want to see. Now, whether they address that and bring in other pieces, I think this offensive line still has the potential to be good, but as of late, they haven't been great. So hopefully they can go ahead and figure that out. But I think there's still potential there at the offensive line. Now, what other weapons does Derek Carr have, right? Like I mentioned, they traded away Amari Cooper. We all know that. He's on the Dallas Cowboys, as happy as ever. They also used to have Michael Crabtree, who just recently was released by the Baltimore Ravens. Maybe he can come back to the Oakland Raiders. You never know. But we've seen, like I mentioned, Derek Carr find success. And he's found success when Amari Cooper and Michael Crabtree were on this team. In 2016, statistically, Amari Cooper, I'm going to read him out, 132 targets, 83 receptions, 1,153 receiving yards, and 5 receiving touchdowns in that season in 2016. All right, and Michael Crabtree in that year had 145 targets more than Cooper, 89 receptions more than Cooper, 1,003 receiving yards, and 8 receiving touchdowns. In that season, Carr threw for 28 passing touchdowns, 13 to his 2 best receivers. These two had had monster years. They were fantasy relevant. These were, honestly, this is their 2 best career statistics for an entire season that these 2 players have had thus far in their careers. So is it going to improve? Potentially? It could potentially happen, but we've seen Carr find success, and especially with pretty good talent. Now, what surrounds him now, other than Antonio Brown, which is going to be fantastic. This last season in 2018, Jared Cook Jr., the tight end, Sasquatch himself, he led the team in targets, receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns. He led all potential receivers or tight ends or running backs in all receiving stats. I mean, that's pretty ridiculous when a tight end is leading your team. Other than that, Jared Cook, he's going to still be there. He's consistent. And, he was the number 5 tight end in fantasy football this past season. Other than that, we have Jordy Nelson, who is still on the roster. I think Jordy Nelson's lost a couple steps. Obviously, I'm sure he would like to be in Green Bay, and so would Aaron Rodgers. He'd like to see, Jordy Nelson out there helping him out, but it's not the case. Here's the thing. Jordy Nelson last season, he started off a little slow, had a couple games in which he was statistically relevant, and then he kind of got hit with the injury bug. Now, I may have thrown around the idea that, Jordy Nelson doesn't want to play anymore because they're just tanking games, and then other people were saying he might retire. To be honest, Jordy Nelson ended the 2018 season pretty well off. In the last 5 weeks of the fantasy football season in 2018, Jordy Nelson had a combined 48 targets, 38 receptions, 386 receiving yards for a combined 57.6 half-point PPR fantasy points, which, on average in those 5 weeks, about 11.52 fantasy points per week, which pretty much had him at a low-end wide receiver 2, high-end wide receiver 3 upside. Yes, he didn't have any receiving touchdowns in those 5 weeks, but 11.5 fantasy points and a half-point PPR a week in the last 5 weeks, that's pretty consistent. That kind of shows that as the weeks progressed and as the season went on, a rapport was kind of built between him and Carr, and hopefully they can continue to work on that because there's going to have to be another threat on this field other than Jared Cook in order to help Antonio Brown out. We can only talk about Antonio Brown as himself for so long because we know he's got the talent. Now, whether he produces or not has to do with the pieces surrounding him. It has to do with whether Jared Cook's going to find himself open or, Jordy Nelson's going to be good, whether that offensive line's going to protect Derek Carr, whether the run game, whoever that may be, if Marshawn Lynch comes back, if Doug Martin is the running back, Jalen Richard's out of the backfield, whoever it may be, they need to be able to produce and they need to be able to pull attention and game plan away from Antonio Brown in order to, help him out a little bit, right? We've seen Antonio Brown, especially the last couple of years. He's had Juju Smith-Schuster. He's had Le'Veon Bell. He's had James Conner. He's had other offensive threats within that Steelers offense that has pulled attention away from him. Now, this also helps other receivers, right? There's a reason why Juju Smith-Schuster right now is being talked about as a top 5 wide receiver. Besides the fact that now he's currently the number 1 wide receiver of the Steelers offense, last season he was statistically one of the best wide receivers in the NFL. If I'm not mistaken, let me go ahead and pull up these stats. I swear I had them up, but all of a sudden they're not in front of me. But hey, you know what? Let's go ahead and pull up some Juju Smith-Schuster stats. Last season, he had 241 fantasy points, which was a combined total of 111 receptions, 1,426 receiving yards, and 7 receiving touchdowns. I mean, goodness gracious. He was the number 2 wide receiver on this team, and that's where his statistics were at. So imagine if you can have Antonio Brown on one side of the field pulling double coverage, pulling attention, and still being able to produce fantasy-wise and statistically, there's got to be another piece within this offense that is going to get an uptick because of so much pressure being pulled to the other side of the field, which, it sounds like good news to me. Other than that, like I mentioned, I wanted to talk about Juju Smith-Schuster a little bit, talking about his potential value as we approach the 2019 season. I'm just looking at the landscape of wide receivers right now, and I'm thinking, okay, Antonio Brown, he is still a, give or take, top 7 or 8 wide receiver in the NFL right now when it comes to fantasy perspective, okay? Yes, playing on the Raiders, it's a little bit of a downgrade. I mean, not a little bit. Let's take that. It's a downgrade comparatively to playing for Ben Roethlisberger. Many people think Ben Roethlisberger is a Hall of Fame quarterback. I also believe in that narrative, right? Having won 2 Super Bowls, the guy's produced statistically in the last couple seasons. Yes, he doesn't win as many games as he potentially should. He has a couple off the field issues, but Ben Roethlisberger is as good as it gets when it comes to quarterbacks. Just this last season, I think he was the number 3 quarterback in fantasy in 6-point per passing touchdown leagues. He's still able to sling it, even though he's contemplated retirement. So even though he's getting a downgrade at the quarterback position, Antonio Brown is still amongst the wide receivers within the top 7 or 8. I see like DeAndre Hopkins, Devontae Adams, Tyreek Hill, Julio Jones, Juju Smith-Schuster, Odell Beckham, and Antonio Brown, right? Like, not in that particular order, but I'm just thinking off the top of my head, yeah, DeAndre Hopkins, Devontae Adams, Julio, Tyreek Hill, OBJ, Juju Smith, and Antonio Brown. I mean, those look like a good top 8 wide receivers. Now, whether or not Antonio Brown goes, the 3rd wide receiver off the board or the 5th or 6th wide receiver off the board, we just have to understand that he is still going to be garnered as a 1st or 2nd round talent, without a doubt. If he ends up falling to the 3rd round, the only way I see that potentially happening is if, in fact, the Raiders go and they draft a rookie quarterback or something of that case, in which we can expect less production because of the struggles of a rookie, et cetera, et cetera. Other than that, I think, Antonio Brown, he's a top 8 wide receiver. And on top of that, Juju Smith, you can't mention Antonio Brown within that top 8 without also mentioning Juju Smith-Schuster, who is going to be the number 1 wide receiver for the Pittsburgh offense, which loves to throw the ball. Ben Roethlisberger throwing over 5,000 yards this past season. The question remains at this point, who is going to be the number 2 wide receiver for the Pittsburgh Steelers? I mean, that is going to be a very valuable seat to sit in. We know that James Washington last season was drafted out of, if I'm not mistaken, was it Oregon State, to come in and be the number 3 wide receiver for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Obviously, they didn't really end up formulating into anything. James Washington had his struggles last season and really wasn't able to find his stride. Was often inactive in specific weeks because Ben Roethlisberger wasn't satisfied with his knowledge of the playbook and his production. So there was a little bit of a rift there in itself, but really, I guess we just have to wait and see who's going to be that number 2 wide receiver for the Pittsburgh Steelers, because that position in itself is going to have a lot of opportunity. We're not going to see Ryan Switzer or Vance McDonald have huge upticks of fantasy relevance. And we know that James Conner, as long as he's healthy, second half of the regular season, missed a lot of time, and that hurt his fantasy stock a lot, especially because can't people rely upon him? Injuries are something that we don't want to draft. We don't want to draft players that consistently get injured. So hopefully he doesn't, maintain that injury bug. But we know, he's going to be productive, but not productive enough to fill in that number 2 wide receiver spot. We've still got to figure that out. Whether they go and address that in free agency now, or they go and address that in the draft, we're just going to have to wait and see, and hopefully have some fun theorizing what's going to happen. Other than that, that's pretty much my thoughts on the matter. Congratulations to the Oakland Raiders. Hopefully this move, kind of establishes you guys. You have the new face of your franchise. The guy that was on the Madden cover this season is now in a different jersey. So for those of you who are Raiders fans, eventually they're going to be the Las Vegas Raiders, and that's going to be fun. But yeah, no, this is exciting. I always get excited when free agency moves around. There's another couple moves that I'm going to talk about, probably make a video tomorrow, specifically on Carlos Hyde and Damian Williams, considering Carlos Hyde was just signed by the Kansas City Chiefs today, which kind of pisses me off a little bit, considering I valued Damian Williams a lot higher than a lot of people did. I thought he was being extremely undervalued, but now that that's coming through, potentially his value may have just been like withered to nothing. But anyway, we'll talk about that later. I want to thank everybody for watching. If you haven't already, click that subscribe button for more content. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Every week, a couple videos every week talking about fantasy football until we get to the 2019 season. We're excited. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, hit me up down below. I'll be sure to get to you. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and have a good Sunday. All right, see you guys.